Hello YouTube! You might have noticed that there's a lot of pushback against bodybuilding training nowadays. People who train purely for hypertrophy seem to have gained this reputation of being small science nerds who neurotically obsess over optimal training. And when you compare that to the much cooler methods of strength athletes, for example, who just horse weight around with complete and total disregard for muscle growth, or the hybrid athletes who can move their bodies in tons of fun ways, it does seem that bodybuilding now looks cringe and lame in comparison. And as someone whose name is natural hypertrophy, this is not something that I enjoy seeing. But I must admit that the critics have a point. It does seem that bodybuilding training has lost its way. And so if we want more people to get into natural bodybuilding, it's our responsibility as those who train purely for hypertrophy to understand exactly why. What happened to get to that point? And it's exactly what I want to do in this video. I'm going to try and figure out what exactly made hypertrophy training so lame in the first place, which should logically also lead us to a discussion of what constitutes effective bodybuilding training. And to do so, I'm going to base my argument off of two videos I found on Instagram. The first one by Emanuele Pescari and the second by Eugene Theo. And we're going to begin with the second one, where Dr. Def gives us his perspective on what he perceives hypertrophy training to have become. So as you have noticed, this video is a skit making fun of bodybuilding training. It's comparing a bodybuilder who is using baby weight with a very precise setup and no intensity to someone who trains for strength and who lifts much more weight, but is also much more intense. And you can tell that between the two styles, one is objectively better than the other. But it would be reductive to say that this is the extent of the argument because there's also a wall of text that comes with it. But I first want to take a look at the video because the majority of people on Instagram only look at the video. So the first thing I want to point out, obviously, is that this is a straw man of hypertrophy training. It's taking one specific lift that everyone wants to make fun of, the iliac pull down, and saying, okay, this is hypertrophy training, this is bad, therefore the entirety of hypertrophy training is bad. And this is of course highly disingenuous because proper hypertrophy training is not just that. Actually, proper hypertrophy training should include a majority of heavy compound movements taken to failure. The funny thing being that in his comparison, Emmanuel, when he goes on to the strength side, includes a ton of movements that I would personally include in a bodybuilding program. So stuff, for example, like the barbell pullover, you know I'm a big advocate of it. I think it's tremendous for size. The drag curl is also great for bicep development, and the CC squat is good for quads. Equating these movements to being specifically for strength, to me, makes little sense. But I think what Emmanuel was trying to convey here is that modern bodybuilders have turned their back on movements that are very effective for their sport because they focus too much on stuff that is much more gimmicky. And in that sense, I perfectly agree. You have staples of hypertrophy that existed 100 years ago that are still relevant today, should still be implemented today, but they have fallen out of favor because of a certain science hype around other lifts that make them less shiny in comparison. Now let's look at the other lifts in that list that Emmanuel presents, because if some of them are good for hypertrophy, others not so much, starting with the one-arm press. Now, I personally do one-arm military dumbbell press to grow my shoulders, but I do them in a very specific fashion. I do them with a straight torso without bending the knee, and I do them with a pause and a slow tempo. This is, in my opinion, of course, optimal for muscle growth. When you twist your torso to the side, like you see people who do strongman, for example, do, now the lift is much more skewed towards performance and strength. Why? Because you manipulate your levers to be able to use more weight, which is perfectly logical. If you do a circus dumbbell event and you do a clean, strict press with a slow control negative, you're an idiot because you're not going to win. This is why there are different practices for different sports. And this also extends to whatever version of the tricep extension he shows in the video. He does his explosively with a barbell. Good for him. If you're a bodybuilder, you prefer a dumbbell for heightened stability, and you also prefer a slow negative, because this is what is going to correlate to more tricep size. The point I'm trying to make here is that most movements need heightened stability to be optimal for hypertrophy, which is exactly the mentality that gave birth to the iliac pull-down in the first place. The iliac pull-down, which is not a bad lift. I know it's extremely trendy, especially if you're more of a meathead, hardcore bodybuilder type, to shit on that movement, but I think it's completely ridiculous. The reason why people love to dog on that lift in particular is because, one, it's extremely popular, so it gets your attention, and two, because it crystallizes everything wrong with modern hypertrophy training. Oftentimes, when you see people, influencers, demonstrate the movement, they tend to be small, and they also tend to do them with very high reps, super low tempo, baby weight, and little to no intensity. And when you see a stick doing a movement with 20 pounds, your first instinct as a lifter is to make fun of the guy and to dismiss the movement as garbage because, well, we associate the influencer that promotes the lift with the quality of the lift. But this is the proof that the issue doesn't lay with the lift itself. Rather, it's with the type of people who attempted to popularize it, and also the type of people who bought into the idea that this movement was somehow superior because of biomechanics, but who forget that without proximity to failure and effort, every single movement sucks. I do not care how effective it is at recruiting the muscle fibers. If you never push a movement, it is always going to result in subpar hypertrophy. So in a sense, the iliac pull-down is a noob trap. It convinces people who are new to the gym to focus all of their efforts on a lift that is not very difficult and that requires almost no technical adaptation because, well, it's on a cable, it's in a fixed alignment, so it's very easy to get into. Instead, they could be doing something like a dumbbell row, which would be very effective to build upper body mass. They could be doing a pull-up for the lats if they wanted, but the issue is that these movements are the exact opposite. They are either very demanding in terms of core stability with the dumbbell row, so they're going to be extremely uncomfortable, or they require a ton of coordination like the pull-up. And this requires work, it requires patience. And this is something that Emmanuel describes in his post where he says that people seem to turn their back on movements that take a long time to learn without realizing that the payback after you've invested all that time in the lift might very well be more worth it than getting into something you're good at immediately, because it means that your rate of progression and more importantly your range of progression is going to be completely different. And as he goes on to explain, this also seems to be true for the majority of modern hypertrophy training. Most of the time what you will see is guided movements on machines for high reps. And while I personally agree that this can be extremely beneficial for hypertrophy, it only works if you know how to push yourself. If you put a beginner on these machines, oftentimes what you will find is that they'll go very easy and they'll sandbag the fuck out of every single set because the longer the set is, the harder it is to maintain intensity. If I have you do a 3 rep max on any given movement, you don't have a choice. You have to give me your A game. But if I give you a 15 rep max, most people by rep 8 are going to just go through the movement, meaning that the load they're going to be using is going to be sub-intensive, and so the results they'll get is also going to be subpar. The problem is that some people take this and they run with it. They use it as an argument to say, oh, this means that high reps and machines, cables, or the Smith machine must be inferior to free weight with low reps. And that's not what I said. Rather, what I mean is that once you have learned how to put in the effort, doing a 15 rep max on incline press on the Smith is going to be crazy good for hypertrophy because you're going to be able to really target the muscle and have no other factor mess with your ability to put in the effort. But you have to get there first. You have to learn how to push yourself first. And once you get there, you realize that, yeah, the two options, the free weights or the machines, are both just as effective. It's simply that they provide you with different benefits. And this is the thing that strength athletes don't want to hear. Oftentimes, you will find that their arguments might be sound, but that the intention behind the argument is a bit devious. And this is something that I've noticed on the post by Dr. Def as well, because if you've noticed, he also makes fun of people who use straps. It's sort of a telltale sign. If you train strictly for size, whether you can grip the weight or not is really irrelevant as long as it doesn't diminish your ability to grow your forearms. And in that case, I can tell you that, yeah, using straps on your back work isn't going to impair with your ability to train your upper limb. If anything, it's the exact opposite. Now you'll be more fresh to isolate that muscle, which will give you more growth. Anyone who thinks that letting their grip limit their back growth is somehow badass is just an idiot, because you're just leaving gains on the table. And likewise, as I explained, there's a reason why hypertrophy training doesn't include certain lifts that have fallen out of favor. For example, in the clip, we see the hip thrust to floor press. Why did people give that up? Gee, I don't fucking know. Maybe because it's all over the place. Maybe because the weight you'll be using for one exercise that is an hybrid to the other is not going to be relevant. You're going to have to decide which one you want to challenge, and oftentimes it's going to be the floor press because you can hip thrust more than you can floor press. So you end up doing one part of the lift sub-intensely. Why would you do that when you can just start with the floor press or do hip thrusts? That is just logical. And then stuff like the Arthur lift. Why would bodybuilders not do this? Maybe because it's intensely dangerous, maybe because the risk to reward ratio is extremely low. And if you enjoy that lift because it's cool, because you enjoy the way it makes you feel, that's good for you. But I would be extremely surprised and curious to find someone who can prove me by A plus B using logic that this lift should be put in a bodybuilding program. I don't think you would be able to. And I know that this argument of certain movements being simply better than others for muscle growth is often rejected by people who counter it by saying that the Bronze Era bodybuilders also happen to be strongmen, and that their training for the two practices didn't differ that much. And these people have a point, but they have to keep in mind that what they're discussing took place 100 years ago. We are now in the future. And isn't the entire point of the fitness industry to evolve the methods? I think that if we were all still training exactly the same way we were 100 years ago, it would just mean that we failed. We failed at the one thing we were supposed to do, which is to advance the game. I would also think that our glorious ancestors, the strongmen of old, would be highly disappointed to see that we did nothing but twiddle our thumb for 100 years. The cerebral and technological advancement of lifting is directly responsible for the better physiques and the higher strengths that we see nowadays. Because yes, we are stronger and bigger than we used to be without drugs. Okay, I'm talking about the natural community here. And something that proves my point is the fact that modern strongmen train very differently from their predecessors. Their methods have evolved even though technically they're doing the same sport. So is it really that surprising that hypertrophy training branched out so dramatically from strength, the way it was back then at least? It's not a sign that it's lost its way, actually it's quite the opposite. It's the sign that it's found its way. And a proof I have of this is the Smith machine. The Smith machine is a good indicator of who is just a boomer and who actually uses their brain. Because every time you run into people who make fun of it, it shows that they don't even know why the Smith machine was invented. For your edification, it was invented by Jacques Lalanne, who is a legendary bodybuilder who created the Smith machine with his own two hands because he wanted to recreate a method to use barbell training without the risk involved with free weights. And this is what he came up with. And one of his buddy who visited his own gym saw this and thought, okay, I have to recreate this. We have to make this available to everyone. This is how good the technological improvement was for the sake of hypertrophy and muscle growth. So when you see people nowadays who make fun of it or who make fun of people who use the Smith, the only thing they're doing is they're revealing that they know nothing about the history of fitness. And this history of fitness, in truth, is as follows. You have the granddaddy of everything, which is old-time strongman, that then gave birth to modern strongman, powerlifting, bodybuilding, etc., etc. So we all owe to this period, but in truth, what we owe them is to improve on the methods that they gave us. You can appreciate and respect the past while at the same time continuing to innovate to further the practice of your own sport. And this is when we get into the real reason why I believe that hypertrophy training lost its way and why it is so lame nowadays. The issue is not that it's attempting to divorce from strength sports. That was perfectly fine. The problem is that by doing that, it started to reject aspects of the sport that turned it into a caricature of itself, something that the video by Eugene Theo actually exemplifies quite well.
I was surprised how many people got triggered by this exercise. But to be fair to the haters, the exercise isn't the best pick for hypertrophy because it's very unstable and you can't load up with a lot of weight. Fortunately though, that's not why I do it. One thing a lot of people don't realize is that literally everything in the gym is made up. There are some guiding principles like progressive overload and stability and range of motion, but you really can do anything if you enjoy it. And if you don't like something, you don't have to do it. Nobody's forcing you to do anything.
So, that video was a response to a previous video that he made where he demonstrated a lift that was supposed to unlock your lats, where he recommended people do light and fluid reps as opposed to trying to muscle the weight around and keep things stiff and rigid. Now, I don't know about you, but when I hear the words stiff and rigid, I have flashbacks of my teenage years when I started bodybuilding. I had people tell me, oh, don't bodybuild, you're going to end up all puffed up with fake muscles that can't do anything, you're going to be all stiff, you won't be able to bend over. I don't know about you, but that sounds an awful lot like functional training propaganda that I now see a lot on social media. People who, instead of promoting their practice with its own merit, use bodybuilding as a scapegoat and say, oh, whatever I'm doing right now that looks like I'm a monkey on crack is actually great because that way you won't end up like a bodybuilder. You won't end up with useless muscles. Like I've seen some people say, useless muscle, a muscle is a muscle. If you train it through a function, it will fulfill that function. It starts and ends there. Ranges of mobility can be gained while training for hypertrophy. Actually, they should be gained by training for hypertrophy. It's exactly this type of polarizing mentality that has led hypertrophy training to lose its way. It's something that I've tried to explain on the channel multiple times in the past. Yes, hypertrophy training is separate to strength training, but the qualities that are present in both. You will still need to progress in strength to grow as a bodybuilder. You will still need to pay some attention to mobility, all for the sake of growing bigger, because what exactly unlocks hypertrophy? It's the ability to move the body through a certain range of motion, so to allow the joint to go through that range of motion, to tap maximally into the muscle, and it's also the ability to heighten the load so as to continuously put more mechanical tension on the muscle so as to justify its growth. It's as simple as this. Your goal will never be to become stronger, but you will have to become stronger, and likewise with flexibility. And the good thing is that any good hypertrophy program is going to provide both. Example, you have a program and you do Romanian deadlift. What exactly is the Romanian deadlift? It's a stretch. It's a hip hinge where you bend forward and you stretch your hamstring. And how do you grow on the RDL? You put more weight on it and you extend the range of motion by, for example, not actually bending the knee, keeping the knee locked. That is a good hypertrophy lift. What about the pull-up? Likewise with the pull-up, your goal should be to go as deep as possible to stretch the lats as much as possible via scapular retraction, and that is how you're going to grow a big ass back. Same for the preacher curl. The deeper you can go with the more weight you can use, the bigger your biceps are going to become. All of this means that any exercise that is going to be sold to you as good for mobility should also be taken to failure. It should also be done heavy, because if it's good for mobility, it most likely also is going to be good for hypertrophy if you include all of these factors. And the good news is that you don't even have to lower the weight preemptively, because the range of motion is going to do that for you. Because increasing range of motion already mechanically lowers the load you'll be able to use on it anyways, because it makes the movement more difficult since it challenges the muscle more. So going light on these movements to me is counterintuitive, because you're going to get less mobility from it, but also less muscle gains. And this is exactly how you end up with the iliac pull down. This is what made this lift so garbage and the laughingstock of the fitness community. That being said, I don't think that the people who hated on Eugene's lift did so for these reasons. I think that they did that strictly as a knee-jerk reaction, because people nowadays tend to scoff at anything that isn't the basics. If it's not something that is time-tested, they'll say it's a gimmick and they'll say it's garbage. And Eugene actually made a good point in his response post when he says that what constitutes the basics is entirely subjective and it's up to whoever has decided that these lifts would make the list. If you look at what makes up the basics nowadays, you have what? Squats, bench, deadlift. Interesting. It also happens to be the 3 lifts that powerlifters compete on. Could that maybe be a coincidence? If you look at what the basics were during the golden era, you will find a bunch of movements we no longer do. Silver era, likewise. Look at the pullover. It has deserted commercial gyms. Why? Is it bad now? But it was good then. So what exactly happened? Well, what happened is that there is such a thing as a meta. The meta is the list of lifts that are highly popular at a given time. And who makes these lifts popular? Well, in the modern era, the platinum era, our era, it's us. It's influencers who decide what is hype and what isn't. So using appeals to tradition to trash certain exercises is dumb. It's just as stupid as telling people that we should just all go back in time and train like the old school strongman. Because all of it is mostly based on popular opinion and on hype, and we both know how little these two matter. And if you don't agree with me, look again at the iliac pull down. Why is that lift popular? Because some popular influencers pushed it, and because some people bought into that gimmick. That's it. So what do we do next? If we cannot rely on these factors to know which lift is good for hypertrophy, what remains for us? Well, I have a very simple way to decide what functions and what doesn't. To not be caught in the fitness zeitgeist of hype, we simply have to disregard this and look at the characteristics that define every single movement. And once you do that, you'll realize that every single movement that is now deemed good for hypertrophy all share the same characteristics. They're all hyperstable and they all focus on stimulus to fatigue ratio, which explains why a lot of heavy compound movements are nowadays deemed bad for hypertrophy because they're too fatiguing. And they instead have been replaced by movements who give you maximal stimulus with minimal accessory fatigue. And this is exactly the problem with modern hypertrophy training, because this approach, while effective and important, only works to a point. But if you take it too far, you end up with a caricature of what proper hypertrophy training should be. Let's go back to our example of the Romanian deadlift. The Romanian deadlift is a great posterior chain movement for the hamstring, glutes, and lower back. Let's compare it to a leg curl. What, between the leg curl and the RDL, has a better strength to fatigue ratio? The answer is the leg curl, because it's an isolation movement that doesn't tax the joints or the lower back. Does it mean that the leg curl is a better movement for posterior chain development than the RDL? I don't know many people who would make that argument, and yet on paper, it should be. What the leg curl does better than the RDL is that it allows you to isolate the hamstring in priority without taxing the rest of the body. But what exactly is the point of doing that if you're not going to tax the rest of the body? And that's where the RDL come into play. Yes, the RDL is extremely fatiguing, but it's because it provides you with complete development. It's going to develop your upper back, it's going to develop your traps, again, your glutes, your lower back, to a great extent. If you take two lifters, one who does RDL and one who does leg curls only, yeah, maybe the guy who only does leg curls is going to be less fatigued, but he'll also be much weaker and much smaller. Let's apply the same logic to the pull-up versus iliac pull-down argument. One, the pull-up will give you more overall stimulus for the back and the arms, but also much more fatigue in the tendons of the elbow, the bicep, and the shoulders. That is true. And the iliac pull-down will allow you to target the lats in priority with minimal wear and tear. So if we look at these two qualities and sets of flaws, what do we conclude? Well, my conclusion is that to get the most out of both of these movements, they need to be used conjointly, because they cover each other's weaknesses. This means that a program with only big movements, yes, will make you bigger, but will also lead to imbalances and potential overuse injuries, while a program with only precise movements might be very safe and not fatiguing at all, but it also will be much worse for overall size. The problem with modern hypertrophy training is that it focuses way too much on the later class of exercises because it's obsessed with being as little fatiguing as possible, and it's led to a sort of witch hunt where any movement that is not stable enough is dismissed as bad for bodybuilding. And that can create issues because I've seen excellent movements becoming bastardized for the sake of hypertrophy-specific training, where they end up just losing a lot of their flavor and values. Case in point, the incline curl. The incline curl is a lift that I embraced for the past year, and with a very slight incline, it's a tremendous movement. But I'm starting to see more and more bodybuilders on Instagram who promote doing them with a super deep incline where you're pretty much laying horizontally on your back. And you know, I'm a curious guy, so whenever I see someone present a new variation as excellent for growth, I try it. And what I found when I attempted it is that the bottom part of the lift became horribly difficult and the top portion was super easy, which points to a strength curve that is all over the place. So now you have a movement that sure is super stable. You can't move anything, your shoulders are frozen in place. But guess what? It makes the lift worse. It makes progression harder, it makes grinding the reps harder. All of that for what? An extra stretch at the bottom? If I wanted that type of stretch, I would do Bayesian curls on a cable because that way the tension would be constant throughout the movement. And that points to the irony of the situation. Lifts like this end up getting a reputation as easy lifts that you should do with light weight for the stretch or the pump or whatever, when in reality, isolation movements should be the exact opposite because they have the best stimulus to fatigue ratio. That means that you can take them to the red zone with intensity techniques like a rest pause, and you should be absolutely fine because whatever amount of fatigue you will accumulate is going to be extremely, extremely low. On the flip side, something like a heavy compound movement benefits much more from reps in reserve because of the total amount of stimulus you get for every single rep. And the reason why I say it's ironical is because something like the iliac pull down is actually a very intense lift because its stimulus profile indicates that you should take it to failure and you should pull extremely hard because the risk of injury is almost zero. But for some reason, it was promoted as the exact opposite, a movement done in very high rep ranges with very slow tempo. And this is why people hate it so much. It's not the movement, it's the rhetoric that surrounds it. It's the science-based gimmick that attributes qualities to movements that our bare eyes apparently cannot detect, and when we try these movements, they seem to suck entirely. Not because they're bad, but because the parameters that the people who promote these lifts like to use to present them as superior for hypertrophy actually do the exact opposite. Once that's accepted, we can focus on trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. And when we get to that point, there are really two schools of thought. As I said, you have the science-based crew that some people like to refer as nerds, and then you have the experience-based crew that some people refer to as meatheads or just idiots. And that is an entire discussion altogether, one that I am actively working on and that I should be releasing very soon. It's going to be my next fitness essay. So if you're looking forward to that video, or if you enjoy my work in general, please consider supporting the channel on Ko-fi. It's the first link in the description. You can pledge or donate whatever amount you decide is fair. Anything is appreciated. And if you have thoughts or opinions on the topic I spoke about today, please weigh in as well. Do you think we're going in the right direction? Are you happy with the state of bodybuilding influencers on Instagram or YouTube? Do you think some changes need to be made? Let me know and I will happily read your comments and answer if you have any questions. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.